Okay, thank you, George Galloway, once again for coming on to Not the Andrew Marr Show. We are 20 years since the invasion of Iraq, and it seems like not that long ago to me, but I just wanted to refresh people's minds about what was actually happening before the Iraq invasion, especially what you were doing to try to stop it happening in the first place, and also the sanctions that were going on before the invasion itself. So I'm just going to play a short video of footage from that time to refresh your memory.
Okay.
There is only one solution to this crisis.
هناك حل واحد لهذه المأساة.
And that's the lifting of these criminal sanctions.
وهو رفع هذا الحصار المجرم.
And I hope that the majority of the permanent five will stand firm.
وآمل أن يقوم الأعضاء الدائميون الخمس
and insist
بالإصرار على
on the lifting of this siege.
على رفع هذا الحصار.
On the front of our lovely British vehicle today,
إن على واجهة حافلتنا الجميلة البريطانية,
the flags of Britain and Iraq are flying together.
مرفوع علم بريطاني وعلم عراقي مع بعض.
It must be some years since that has happened.
في تصوري أنه قد مضى زمن طويل منذ رفع العلمان مع.
The British and the Americans and the others have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to try to break this country, to try to break it into three parts so that they could dominate it and give it orders, order it what to do. They completely failed.
It's an attempt to save the life of this little child, which is worthwhile in itself. But it has a broader purpose also. It has the purpose of showing the people of Britain that Iraqis are human beings too, and they have children just like us. And if we cut them, then they bleed. And the children in this hospital are bleeding. And in every hospital in Iraq, children are bleeding as a result of sanctions. No notes or anything we need to take?
This is all shrapnel.
Shell, yes,
Some of them had been removed for dangerous.
Did he have any warning of the attack, or the bomb suddenly exploded beside him?
This is absolute recklessness. It's absolute lawlessness. And it's absolutely murderous. 2 people were killed and more than 20 injured, as we've seen here. Innocent civilians who have no connection to any political dispute. Iraq has millions of friends who are rallying to her side to oppose the threat of aggression and war from the United States, perhaps supported only by 2 countries, Israel and the United Kingdom. Everyone else in the world, from Nelson Mandela to Gerhard Schroeder, the German Chancellor, are saying, we don't want any more war. There is enough war in the Middle East. From Palestine to Kabul, there is enough war. I challenge Mr. Blair from this rostrum today. Name 1 place. Name 5 places. Name 50 places where you say you know there are weapons of mass destruction being produced. And I'll tell you that I have the agreement of the Iraqi leadership that any site you name, Mr. Blair, I can take all of the British delegation immediately to that site so that they can see for themselves the truth of your allegation. Are you listening, Mr. Blair?
Well, that's an incredible amount of work that you were doing before the invasion of Iraq to support people in Iraq facing sanctions. Can you give us a background to what the sanctions were about before we talk about the military threat?
Well, ironically, Iraq was practically the only Arab country I had never visited prior to 1993, and I would have been arrested if I had visited, because I was a known associate of the Iraqi opposition. And of course, the regime there, like the regime in most countries, increasingly brooked little in the way of opposition. But I went under the leadership of the late and great Labour Member of Parliament, Tam Dalyell, that many will have fond memories of. And both of us were shocked and utterly horrified by what we found there in 1993. And we began a campaign to have those sanctions lifted. The sanctions killed more than 500,000 Iraqi children. As Madeleine Albright famously said, she thought that that was a price worth paying. But we did not. And we did everything we could to lift the sanctions. And after 9/11, it became increasingly obvious that the empire was headed for war and more war, and that after Afghanistan would come Iraq. So we threw our energies into trying to stop the war on Iraq. We did not stop it, but we mustered a truly historic, literally historic level of campaigning. We drew the biggest crowds over and over again that have ever assembled on the streets of Britain. In the greatest of them, February 15th, 2003, up to 2 million people gathered in Hyde Park after several marches through London from different places. It is a seminal occasion in the modern history of Britain, but we had a government then that didn't listen. It didn't listen to its own people, it didn't listen to, I think it was 130 Labour members of Parliament who didn't support Tony Blair, George Bush's invasion, didn't listen to the Pope, didn't listen to the United Nations, didn't listen to aroused civil society in Britain. And that began a process which not only put an end to Blair himself, just 5 years later, he was ignominiously slinking from the British political stage, but also the beginning of the end of the Labour Party. It came back on life support under Jeremy Corbyn for a very short period, but I'm afraid it's dead now also, another casualty of the Iraq war.
Yeah, well, and that's a great summary of what happened. But in between all that, I mean, you went out there on a number of occasions, and I seem to remember you were called like the MP for Baghdad or something like that. I mean, what kind of media response did you get when you went out to Iraq?
Well, it was horrifying. I mean, that little girl that we did, in fact, in the end, save her life, though quite badly disabled now. That little girl was treated in the British media as if she were a chemical weapon instead of a victim of chemical weapons used by the British and American forces in the invasion of Iraq in 1991. That girl was talked of as if she were subhuman. And I, as the facilitator of her carriage to Britain and the private medical treatment that we had to pay for to get her, was treated as a manservant of the devil. And the media throughout treated me as if I was mad or bad or both, particularly the state broadcaster, the BBC. Although I've got to say, at least I was on the mainstream media virtually every day in the run-up to the war. I'd never get a look in on the mainstream media now, but at least I'm on your show.
Well, yeah, that's something. I mean, but the sort of propaganda against you, and also that kind of push the conflict that happened, the invasion. Do you see that as having a parallel with what's happening now in Ukraine, for example?
Well, a chilling parallel, not least in that many of the same newspaper and television executives that lied us into the war in Iraq and now grudgingly say that it was a blunder without mentioning their part in that blunder, let alone call it what it was, a crime and a blunder. The same people, they've risen upwards. Andrew Marr himself, who said that the invasion of Iraq made Tony Blair a much taller man than he had been before and had dwarfed his adversaries, including me. He's still going on prime time, albeit this time on a London local radio station. The columnist who just slunk away from the Times, David Aronovich, who famously said that if it turned out there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, he would never believe another word that the Blair government said. Another false promise by Mr. Aronovich. All these pundits and so-called experts, armchair generals, sandpit colonels, that told us the war in Iraq had to be fought, was inescapable, and who had nothing to say, as it turned out to have all been built on a lie, are the very same people who seek to talk us into a war with Russia. And as for me, that opposed both of these wars, I've gone from being an agent of Saddam Hussein to an agent of Vladimir Putin. Of course, I was never an agent of either of them. And although I never was an agent of Saddam Hussein, he never gave me one thin dime. The newspapers and broadcasters who falsely claimed that he had to give me millions.
Well, I'm coming to that now, and I'm just going to play a video of what happened after the invasion and how you were still targeted by the media even then. So I'm just going to play that now.
Joined now by the MP, George Galloway, and by the Labour MP, Eric Joyce. George Galloway, first of all, when you told Iraqis to resist British troops, you must have known that would have been unacceptable to the Labour Party.
It would be better if you got that right.
And I have got it right.
No, you've obviously not got the transcript. I have never asked Iraqis to resist British troops. You see, just as Mr. Blair took the country to war based on a lie, and the media marched along behind him based on a lie, I have never called on anybody to harm British troops. I'm trying to get British troops out of Iraq so nobody can harm them.
I said resist. This is from the transcript from the Leslie Riddick show. Are you actually telling them, Iraqis, to resist? Of course I am. Any foreign country which is invaded illegally by foreigners has the right to, will and should defend themselves.
That's an entirely different thing from what you just alleged and what the Labour Party expelled me for. They said that I called, and you repeated it tonight, that I called on British forces to disobey orders. I didn't. I called on them to disobey illegal orders. That's their obligation under international law. We should get these things right.
In April 2003, the Telegraph claimed that George Galloway was in the pay of Saddam Hussein's regime and that he received around £375,000 a year. The documents on which the Telegraph based its story were found at the Iraqi Foreign Ministry in the chaotic days which followed the war. George Galloway had a link with Iraq through an appeal he set up to help a young girl, Mariam Hanza, who was suffering from leukemia. His legal team say that although he was trying to aid the people of Iraq, he was not a paid agent of Saddam Hussein.
I'm joined now by George Galloway. First of all, you've beaten the Daily Telegraph. Who else are you going to sue for repeating the libel, given that other papers and indeed ministers criticised you?
Well, let me get this one over first. It's been quite a gruelling affair. I had to risk total ruin to bring this case. If I had lost it, I would have been homeless, jobless and penniless and bankrupt and out of public office for good as a bankrupt. So it's not a small undertaking, such a battle as this. But the victory has been, as your report has just said, very comprehensive. But I have now collected although I've not yet got the cash, £250,000 in libel damages in 6 months from the Times, the Sunday Times, the Christian Science Monitor.
So if you're in a role, you may as well go on.
Well, I may well, but I'll, if you don't mind, take my legal counsel on that rather than discuss it on Newsnight.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that you risked all of that to take on the Daily Telegraph, saying something as unbelievably libelous, and you know, if you didn't have that in you to do that, they would have got away with it, wouldn't they?
Yes, I mean, my attitude was because I knew, I suppose in the last analysis, only I knew for sure that these allegations were completely, utterly untrue, that I could only win a libel action. Of course, you can lose a libel action even when you're in the right. But given the scale of the assault that had been launched against me, and given my absolute innocence in the affair, I really didn't even think twice about doing it. And I was ready to risk everything. And in the end, I gained everything. The Telegraph had to pay out £2.3 million in the end. And there were many, many others. And I used to often say, forgive me digressing, why doesn't Jeremy Corbyn sue all these people that are lying about them? If he had done so and won, then history might have turned out rather differently. I know that the judges and the courts and so on are no great friend of the socialist movement, but it seems to me that the courts, the judges, are at least, I think, the last remaining place in Britain where there is any honour to be had, where there is any possibility of justice. You certainly won't get it in Parliament. You certainly won't get it in the media. You won't get it even in the Labour Party. But if there's one place left, in Britain where you can get it, it is in the higher courts of the land. And well, she said I was on a roll. Why not keep going? Well, I did keep going, and I'm living on it until now, 20 years later.
Right. Well, I wanted to just finish by saying, looking at that footage, going through and to find it and researching it, I couldn't help thinking that Iraq, you know, you went there, you just said with Tam Dalyell, to find out a fact-finding thing about what was happening there. You fell in love with Iraq by the looks of what I've seen, and then all of your political journey almost was, you know, from there. I mean, you've become, you lost the Labour whip, you were expelled by Labour. Everything seems to have changed for you since you went to Iraq. I mean, would you say that's true?
Yes, Iraq entered my bloodstream and it's never left it. Even until now, if I hear the word Iraq anywhere, I turn around as if someone called my name. And when I meet an Iraqi, which I do frequently, as millions of them are now living outside of their country, I am still deeply touched and moved by the love that they have, by the respect that they have for the work that I did. And I dream, I still dream of Iraq 20 years on. And of course, at this anniversary, where I'm hearing the word Iraq all around, even David Frum, the George W. Bush speechwriter, said in the Washington Post the other day that Iraq turned out to be a blunder is more clear with every passing anniversary. You've no idea how I felt, how happy I felt to hear, or read rather, him saying that, as he was one of the most ferocious advocates of the war. So the fact that now no one could be found to debate Iraq against me, if you put it up at the Oxford Union, no one would turn up to argue in favor of the war. The vindication is total. The vindication is complete. It's just a pity 1 million people had to leave their guts on the ground in order to bring it about.